Today we're going to have a short discussion about choosing interventions, particularly how to evaluate research and empirical support and whether or not an intervention is going to be a good one for you to choose for that particular child or client. So the first part of this is going to be the evaluation of the interventions themselves. Any intervention that you are trying to look at or thinking about needs to match these four categories set forward by Shigai and Horner. So is it effective? Is it efficient? Is it relevant? And is it durable? And we're going to go through each of these in more detail. So effectiveness is basically saying, we cannot, I love this quote, we cannot afford to experiment on students with practices that have not been proven effective. And just because something in your gut says this sounds great, unless there's data to support it, anything you're doing with a child, if there's no empirical support, is now research or experimenting. And so remember that unless you're actually doing it as some sort of pilot study, um, that you can generalize the results later, and that the individuals who are receiving the intervention are aware that this is a study that they're in, then you should only be using empirically supported methods. And so over here is a list of techniques and how they're defined. So these are certain things you're going to often find within interventions. So if you're reading through interventions and information, and you're like, well, I don't really know what it means to have feedback on performance. Well, it means to provide data indicating progress towards a goal. So you can always come back and use this as a reference sheet. So let's talk some more about effectiveness. So effectiveness, we're going to spend a lot more time on in just a minute. So, that you can know how to read research studies and determine whether or not the findings indicate that it really was effective or not. Efficiency is more about cost benefit analysis. So, you find something you think is going to work. It's got data to support that it works. If it's cumbersome and takes a lot of different people or a lot of extra coaching time or time for the consultee or the consultant, remembering that all children should be in their least restrictive environment. So if the intervention that you're planning is taking them away from the regular education classroom experience, then that means that they're missing out on something. So, whatever you're removing in the classroom, you have to find a way to replace it. And all of that becomes an issue. So it's not just your time, it's others' time. Then materials. If it's going to be really expensive, but it's not going to work really, really well, then why are you doing it? And then finally, it's that same KISS model. Keep it simple. Um, this thing is it going to take, is it just cumbersome and burdensome and has too many moving parts? Okay. And then when you're looking at benefits, is the benefit only going to take place for one client or multiple? So you may be interested in spending more money on a bigger intervention that's school wide and or more time or more energy and something that's going to change the lives of lots of kids. Otherwise, you are trying to figure out how can I help this one client with what they need without investing a ton of money in it. And then the time for benefits is it going to help the person now? But also, if I invest in this money or this time or this training or this mentoring or coaching or whatever, will it affect kids and lives later? So it may only be that Sally teacher is having problems with Jimmy today. But those are the same kind of problems she had last year with another student who was very much like Jimmy. And she's planning on teaching for another 20 years. So even if she only has problems with one student a year with this kind of issue, that could be 20 kids whose lives are being influenced by you teaching her and providing her and consulting with her now. So you have to keep that in mind. And then materials, are the materials actually good? Do we know that they're useful? Are they actually going to make any kind of significant changes? And then just remember, teachers aren't going to do it if they don't think it's going to work, and they think it's going to be too much work, they ain't going to do it. And that's true for almost anybody. That could be parents as well, could be substituted there. So the other one is relevancy. You'll hear it sometimes referred to as being ecologically sound, which is, does it fit? Is this something that teacher or parent is actually going to be able to fit into their lifestyle or into their plan? You say, well, mom, I want you to go and help Jimmy with his calculus homework. Well, if mom never even took calculus, I never took calculus. So if my daughter came to me and said, hey, the teacher wants you to start helping me with calculus, I wouldn't have the first idea how to help her. And so it wouldn't fit for an intervention where mom helps out at home if mama doesn't know how to do any of that stuff. And mama isn't willing to learn it for this particular intervention, right? So you have to think about what that means. So what is needed for relevancy is not just, can the person, like, is this something that somebody can do? It's, do you have buy-in? Is the person who you're expecting to put the intervention in place, are they willing to? Do they like it? Do they think it matches what their beliefs are? Are they willing to make any kind of change in order to make this intervention work? And then, you know, are you going to require all these things? So here's one of my issues with RTI in general. When they were originally discovering it, they had this giant army of graduate students. They sent them out into the field to help provide the interventions and conduct collect the data analysis and conduct the research. And they said, wow, look at the change we saw in the kids. But the moment that you pulled the graduate students out, without having those folks in the system, then it's not sound. It no longer will hold together, because then the administration has to actually pay for somebody to do the support or additional training, or the teachers have to add that to their already busy load. So this is the other thing. Is it actually going to fit within that setting, the culture, or the context? And then durability kind of goes back to this thing. When you pull the army of graduate students out, the whole thing just stops. So, I've talked probably in the past about doing research in a school using a computer-based social skills trainer. And we found that it worked while we were doing it. Um, but, the moment that the software program wasn't free anymore for the research study, the school didn't buy it. They didn't, so it didn't last. The program might have worked, but it didn't last. So the durability is not, does this change last in the kid over time? Although that is also important, but that's more to do with effectiveness. Durability is, once we put this change in the school, or have the teacher change in their classroom, or the child change something in their learning, or whatever it is, are they going to keep doing it? And how do you set up a system for them to keep doing it? Is it sustainable? And here's a whole list of reasons why things may not be sustainable. So just some things to consider. And again, this goes back to the quote, teachers will not do it or continue to do it if it's onerous and they don't perceive it to be beneficial. So how do you keep durability? How do you keep something going? Well, there's strong leadership, and that doesn't mean that, we have a good principal, so she'll keep it going. You have to have someone invested in keeping this particular intervention going, not just in general. You're going to have policies and procedures that make it easy and straightforward. You're going to have to figure out if you're going to need funding and where that funding is going to come from. People need to know who can help them out with this intervention. You need to work with all of the folks who are going to be involved now and in the future. You got to make sure you train the people who are going to be training others. And you have to provide data. People will continue doing something if they see it makes a difference. So these are all some things to think about when you're trying to determine what intervention are you going to choose. So the next step has to do with, how do you identify the interventions that you want to evaluate to begin with? So you want to evaluate for those 4 different areas. great. How do you choose what you're going to evaluate? So I'm just going to give you an idea of what evidence-based is considered to be, that there's some sort of documented evidence of effectiveness, ecologically sound, we just talked about that. Ideally, you would have it do for a proactive instead of reactive. You're helping a kid before they've failed. You see a kid who's at risk and you step in and you help at the at-risk stage or even at the pre-risk stage. Ideally, it has class-wide application. If it doesn't, then if you're doing an individual application, make sure that there's some research to support using individual um, interventions at the class level or class interventions at the individual level. It needs to be something that you can use in a consultation format and can teach. It needs to be something that can actually be done, and it can be evaluated. You have to have a way to collect data to see if it improved. So for something to be evidence-based, you have to have a reliable, valid, and practical method to collect that evidence, right? So this is not super different than the Sugai and Horner discussion about what you need, but we're going to go into more detail about these. So the first thing I want us to make sure that we talk about is the difference between primary and secondary research. Primary research is the research where data was collected. You actually can look at the study and it's got a methods and results section. You know who the intervention was done with, and usually those are in peer-reviewed journals. This is when, for a peer-reviewed journal, you would look at scholar.google.com, or you would go into the university's library system and looking for peer-reviewed journals. If you want to know if journal is good or not, take a look. Do a Google search on that journal and find out things about impact factor and what the purpose is. If the purpose of the journal is more, for practitioners, it has less of a chance that the articles are going to be peer reviewed. If the purpose of the journal is mostly for disseminating research, well, then it's going to be more likely to be primary source. Secondary source, that's usually more of a literature review. People discuss other research that someone else did, and then they try and make it so that it seems usable. So we're going to talk about examples of primary and secondary research in just a second, okay? But before we do that, when you are looking at primary research, there's certain things that you're wanting to look at. Most stats fall into one of two columns, and so in the past, you might have opened up a research article that had a methods and results section, read the literature review, read the discussion, and then you were like, okay, it was enough that somebody else decided that it was a good enough piece. That's not okay, not when you're doing empirical research. It's one of the reasons we make you take statistics classes as well as practitioner classes. And so this is a quick stats primer. But just know that if you're reading the results section and there's an ANOVA, a MANOVA, a t-test, a trend analysis, those are looking at differences. So within the flower situation here, the seeds are the same. The only difference is if it had good soil or fertile soil. So we wanted to know, in this study, I should say we, I have no idea, this is somebody else. Someone wanted to know if soil type related in difference in growth. So differences are one thing that we evaluate, and if you see those kinds of stats, that means that people are evaluating differences. Whereas relationships, where you're looking at if one changes, does the other one change? Those are going to be, if you see correlations, regression, factor analysis, or structural equation modeling, those are all measuring is A related to B. So just here, if you see these sort of statistical terms, that's what they say. That's what they mean when you look in the results section. The researchers were looking at differences, or the researchers were looking at relationships. Okay? And then you'll see terms like statistically significant. Well, there was a statistically significant relationship, or there was a statistically significant difference. Well, that's great. What does that really mean? Statistically significant just means that it's unlikely that it happened due to chance. Or that if it's a 0.05, which tends to be the standard, that there is a 5% chance that there really is no relationship or there really is no difference, but that means that there's a 95% chance that there is an actual notable difference. So that means that if you did this experiment 100 times, you would expect that 95% of the time you would find the difference or the relationship. And 5% you would not, and that's just because of the nature of the stats. So statistically significant just says is it rare or unusual. Practically significant is a totally different idea. Is this difference big enough that it actually is worth our time and investment? So you can have something that's statistically significant, rare, but just because it's rare doesn't mean that it actually has any kind of practical effect. So effect size, and effect sizes are reported a lot of different ways based off of, is it, are you using effect sizes within differences or relationships? The type of effect size is going to be different. But in general, this little n thing here is eta squared. This tends to be the, using Cohen's formula, or Cohen's research, that anything above 0.25 is, considered to be large. I have hiccup. And anything below 0.13 is small. And so if you're saying, you know what, it can be rare and large, and then all of a sudden you're like, okay, so this is a thing. Okay, sorry, I just paused because I'm trying to see if I can get this hiccup on. So just something to think about, that at some sample size, you make the sample really, really big, and at some sample size, if there's any effect size at all, any effect size, even the smallest effect size, then you're going to find some sort of statistically significant difference. And it's just how it is. So just be careful about that. So if you see something that has a really huge sample, that we use 2,000 students, and then, so you're wanting to pay less attention in that case to the statistical significance and more to the effect size. Another thing that is considered a primary source is something called a meta-analysis. And this is not where they have a methods and results section. They're going to have methods and results, but the method isn't going to be samples and stuff like that. What they do instead is they go out and they look at research that already exists, and they find similar studies about a similar topic, pull the effect sizes, and then pool them together to see what is basically the average effect size. And so, when we say, oh, this works in one study, a meta-analysis is preferred because then we can say, you know what? It was replicated over and over again, and these findings continued. So if you see a meta-analysis that measures something different than differences or relationships, instead it measures if it is working consistently across studies. Just an aside here, a lot of journals won't publish something if it's not found to be significant. And then I have, what are some problems here with that model? Well, the biggest issue is remembering that what if it just happened to happen? We just talked about, doing the study and only 5% of the time you didn't find the findings. Well, that's what we're saying when we say it's statistically significant. We did it 100 times, 5% of the time you wouldn't actually see the findings. Okay, that's fine. But what if you did the opposite, which is you got findings, and if you'd done it 95 times and you got nothing, and then you did it 5 more times and you did, well, those are just chance. Those are not real, but those are the ones you're publishing. And so nobody sees the 95 failures. And they say, oh, look, it's real because we found it in this study. So there's going to be some really big issues with that. That little aside is not nearly as important as the stuff we just talked about, which is what statistics, MANOVA, ANOVA, regression, etc., what do they measure? Differences, versus relationships. What is statistically significant? That it just means it's not due to chance. What is an effect size? It means how practically important it is or how big it is. And what is a meta-analysis? That a meta-analysis is another form of primary research, but it just looks at a bunch of articles compounded. So I have an example here of putting this all together where we evaluate a study. And so I'm providing you first with secondary research. So one of the places that that I recommend folks to go to and look for research or ideas is Intervention Central. Intervention Central is a great place where they take research out there and make it available to folks in the field. So, on the right-hand side, using the data that's here in Intervention Central, can you evaluate the effectiveness, the efficiency, the relevancy, and the durability of this intervention? So I want you to stop the recording, read through this, and then see if you can do this based off of this secondary research article. So pause now. All right, welcome back. So there's some of this information that you can get, but you'll notice that a lot of this we just don't really know. And so I'm going to show you, we do know from here though that this Intervention Central information was gathered from an article by Foligno, Ducharme, and Greenwald in 2014. So what you would do to find out the rest of this evaluation of the intervention is to go to that original research article, which is the primary research and is right here. So I've made this article available to you in its entirety, and I want for you to go in and read through the article and see that you're much better able to answer the evaluation of the intervention when you have the actual study in front of you. So for instance, relevancy. Who was in the sample? It was 4 students between age 11 and 14. Now, you don't see that in the secondary version. You don't see that it's only for that age group. They're saying it can be generalized to anybody, right? They're not saying specifically to this one targeted group. But there's no research in here to say that I can use this on preschoolers. There's no research on here to say that I can use this on lower elementary school. I have to be really cautious about this. The other thing is that it says results indicated that 30 minutes of moderate to intense aerobic exercise resulted in approximately 90 minutes of behavioral improvement. So let's go back up here. It says here, instead it says the positive effects of antecedent exercise have been found to last up to 90 minutes. It's not exactly what the article said. The article said that it's about 90 minutes, not up to 90 minutes, because the article probably, if you read deeper than just the abstract, is going to tell you exactly what it is up to. So one of the issues with using secondary sources is that they do a nice job of making research available to teachers or to, at a basic level. But we have to go deeper than just that. We need to go and see, as we're going to do consultation, we need to be able to make sure that all 4 of these things are evaluated before we can decide whether or not we're going to take the time and effort to actually make change in the individual. So what I want for you to do is read the entire article and go through these. We're going to practice more of these activities at a later time, but this is just something I would like for you to do now. All right, and so you are going to, you can just write these right into your digital notes. You don't have to do any kind of second worksheet or anything for this activity. All right, I hope that this primer has helped you in some ways in finding research, identifying the differences between primary and secondary research, and working through whether or not that research is going to work for that child or individual.